This is Glasgow Tea's, not their first event, but the first event that Rachel and I have had the honour of hosting. So thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll have many more events like this as well, but this is our first. So my name's Rebecca Johnson. I'm a PhD student at Glasgow Caledonian University, and my research is looking at children and young people's experience of mental illness, stigma and discrimination with a participatory research approach. That's kind of where I'm at in my research journey, and I'm also hoping to use open science practices and learn more about that as I move through my PhD. Rachel, would you like to say hello?
Yes, I'll say hello. So I'm pretty similar. I'm first year PhD as well at Strathclyde Uni, and I'm looking at self-stigma in young people, so mental health self-stigma, and I'm also going to be using participatory approach, so young people as co-researchers and things, good things like that, and definitely trying to use open science practices, which is something I've not really done before. So we're very much coming here as Rebecca said, keen novices. I like that term, keen to learn. So hopefully we can all learn together.
Yeah, so we recently took over the running of Glasgow Tea, honestly about December, so we're very, very new here. And Glasgow Tea is a branch of ReproducibiliTea, which is the international journal club that seeks to support the promotion and accessibility of open science practices. So it's a really bottom-up process. It's ran by early career researchers across the world. So I think there's 125 institutions involved here with 25 different countries and different branches like Glasgow Tea throughout the world, really. We want to kind of promote a really safe and comfortable learning environment. So like we've said, we don't know everything about open science. We're never going to say we do. We definitely don't. And that's why we're going to invite wonderful speakers whenever we can to share their learning and knowledge about open science with you all and with us. So just some things to note. You do not need to be in Glasgow to attend, especially while we're online. It's really great that we can really widen our reach. You also don't need to be an early career researcher. However, because the way we're going to tailor our content and materials is designed for early career researchers, it's just important to keep that in mind. So we won't always be covering really advanced things. It will be quite introductory and basic at times because that's what we all need. And lastly, I would say we're starting with these online webinar series and these styles of events, but we're also hoping to move forward with things like paper discussions, Facebook group, so we can kind of share learning and share understanding, and hopefully, fingers crossed, at some point in the future, maybe some social networking kind of gathering and events. But obviously, we're not really thinking about any of them now, because that will just remind me that I'm still in my house. So that's who we are. That's what we're here to do. We are going to be posting an introductory video on our YouTube channel, which we're going to be sharing soon, with a bit more information and answering any questions that you may have. So that's who we are, and I'll pass you over to Rachel. Take that.
Yeah, we're just going to do a little bit of housekeeping just before we start. So first thing, I'm sure you will all already know this, but we really want to keep this a very safe space, very respectful. So please just keep that in mind, be polite, be respectful. It's really important that you can keep your mics muted if possible during Rima's presentation. It should be about a 40-minute presentation, and that will allow us some time for discussion and questions afterwards. Depends how you want to do the questions, like feel free to just keep them till the end and then you can unmute yourself and ask Rima yourself, or if you want to post them during the chat throughout, then we can ask that on your behalf. We are recording this session, but we're just going to cut it down so it's just Rima's presentation, and that will be recorded in active speaker view, so it'll just capture Rima. But if you're not comfortable having your camera on during the presentation, that's totally fine, just keep it off, that's fine with us. And we'll be sending out a little survey afterwards just to get some feedback, since this is kind of our first session. So yeah, so today we'll be hearing from Rima Maria-Rahal, who will be talking about science in crisis, open science as a reform movement. I'll just introduce Rima briefly. So Rima studied psychology in Heidelberg and Amsterdam and received her doctorate from Leiden University for her dissertation on the cognitive functions of decisions in social and moral dilemmas, which she worked at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods in Bonn. She worked in Frankfurt and Tilburg and has now rejoined the Max Planck Institute for Collective Goods in the research group on empirical law and economics. She is an alumna of the Open Science Fellowship in this scope, which she developed an open science course on the methodological basis of scientific experimentation, incorporating open science practices. So she's very much equipped to share her knowledge with us, and we can't wait to get started, Rima. So if you are, have I enabled screen sharing? I need to do that.
Let me give it a try. I can press the button. You should be able to see.
Yeah, perfect.
I also love that we didn't test that. We didn't test that in our test period.
I mean, we just got chatting to each other. It happens. But maybe let me quickly see if I can, yes, I can move the slides.
Yeah.
Excellent. I can also see you. I can see the chat-ish. So I'm going to try to keep an eye at that. If something comes up that you'd like me to address, then feel free to leave a message there. I might miss them though, because I'm trying to like handle a couple of different screens here. So it looks like I'm ready to go. Are you ready to go?
Perfect. Over to you, Rima.
All right, well then thank you so much for your very warm introduction and for having me here. I'm very excited to talk today at online Glasgow ReproducibiliTea, you know what I mean, reproducibility. Here we go. And this is one of the challenges in talking about open science, which are the long words that are difficult to get out. But what I want to do today is to give you an overview of open science more generally, and sort of where the perspective of empirical social science that you heard that I'm a psychologist, where that comes in, it tends to be only a small, or people think it's only a small part of open science, which is actually just part of a much larger open movement. So I want to take a look at all the different bits of this today. Since things tend to be very different in very different, let's say, parts of science, it's actually difficult to give this talk because I don't know exactly who's in the room and what you're doing and what your experiences are. So for all I know, that you could have totally different topics of interest and methods that you use. So we are all pretty different. And if we make that assumption, we can just say, well, okay, I guess we're all pretty different. We can also wonder if there's anything that we have in common. And I think one thing that we do have in common is that we do research because we want to find out something about the world. So we're interested in making some of the fog go away. It makes it difficult to see where we're going and to be able to see something about the world. And I think that's probably true for you, no matter which kind of area of science your interest falls into. And let's take this sort of as the common assumption of what we're trying to do. And if we do that, if we say, well, I'm trying to find out something about the world, one thing I can do is I can go to the literature, to the existing body of research in my area, whatever that might be, and see what people have done. So sort of see what they've done in order to make the fog go away. And here I want to change kind of the metaphor a little bit. Instead of talking about fog, I now want to talk to you about cake, which I believe is also very fitting if we are talking at a reproducibility. I really can't say the word, reproducibility. So let's talk about cake. I think probably every one of you has tried to bake a cake from a marvelous recipe they found online, and it's looked so tasty, and then you follow the recipe step by step, and you do everything as you're supposed to, at least you think that you are, and then in the end, sometimes you get a cake that looks exactly like the one that you've seen online. Sometimes, however, these experiments can go wrong. I think this is very similar to how sometimes we approach science. So someone else has done something to shed light onto the path of the world and like find out something about the world. They've described their approach and their result, and they've done so usually in the form of a scientific publication, often peer-reviewed, published in some sort of a journal. And then you go to the journal, you read the paper, and you think, oh, well, this sounds cool. I want to try this myself so that perhaps I can also build on it later. And then when you try this yourself, you might not end up at the same place. And while this might be perfectly innocent, it is also possible that the reason why you don't end up at the same result is that something went amiss along the way. And in other words, we could say that there's something like a disconnect between mission and practice. My mission is to bake this great cake or to be able to find this specific thing. And practice is, well, sometimes it goes wrong, and perfectly innocently so, but sometimes it goes wrong because the cake was a lie. To keep with the pop culture references. So sometimes it is the case that the paper that we consult to learn what other researchers have done contains flaws or other problems, or is just moot on a specific point that I would need in order to make up the same cake batter. And this mission versus practice disconnect, we could highlight at a couple of examples. And if you have nothing nice to say, then people say you should always start with yourself. So I'm going to start with my own discipline and talk about some examples of disconnect between research and practice in psychology. And perhaps one of the more famous ones that maybe you've heard about as well is the one about power posing. So this is the idea that if you make a superhero pose, this will boost your self-confidence and then get you better results, for instance, in a negotiation. And this is a result that other researchers have tried to replicate. This is what we call it when we try to make the same cake in science. So when we try to do the research again that someone else has already done and find the same result, this is what we call a replication. So someone tried to replicate this and they couldn't find it. And later the lead author, Amy Cuddy, who you can see here, she also said that there were some problems with the paper and she would no longer stand by the idea that power posing was a thing. So this is just one example. There are a bunch more that I could give, but I'm going to postpone this for the sake of time. So if you'd like to talk more about examples of the disconnect of mission versus practice, feel free to bring this out in the discussion. So nevertheless, what we can see is that there is sometimes this disconnect, and we can try to make an educated guess about how big this problem actually is. And if we try to make such an educated guess, here's kind of putting it on a scale. So we could say, how replicable is work in science? And it could be 0 or 100. Well, percent. Well, and not really. It can't be 0 or 100% because of the way that we do statistics. So the worst case scenario is that only 5% of work is replicable. And the best case would be that about 92% are replicable. If we assume that either all true effect sizes are 0 or that all original effect sizes are actually valid. So this is kind of the space that we have available. And now we can look at where does the replicability of empirical work actually fall. And one thing we could do is we could just ask people, what do you think? Or like, what's your expectation of how replicable work in your area is? And here in gray in the center, we have one of these, one example where people were asked to estimate this. And this was psychologists who said they think about 54% of the research in their field is replicable. So this is a coin toss, and that's not a sign of great confidence. Okay, but we also have in gray a bit more to the right, the mean expectation of behavioral economists. And they said they thought about 76% of the research in their field would be replicable. So this is a more confident estimate of what would happen. Now, if we look at the empirical attempts to measure replicability in these two areas, we see that actually it was right for economists to be somewhat confident, because if you look at a large-scale replication attempt, about 2/3 of these studies, and this is a pink number on the right, 2/3 of the studies in behavioral economics actually replicated. In psychology, this is pink number to the left, it was only a rate of about 1/3, so much less, and actually worrisome to the degree that it's even worse than a coin toss, like by far. And there's some differences between the psychology studies and the economist studies that were taken into consideration that also explain why there are such differences in the replicability, but those are details. In the end, we can say, well, the number is pretty low. And this is not only a problem in the social sciences, but also if we go to what is like referred to as like a more hard science, let's say cancer biology, this is replicability is also an issue. For instance, there's a reproducibility project in cancer biology that clocks in their replication rate at between 11 and 25%. This is also not great. So overall, we could say this doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. And now we can ask, but why is this what we see? And I think part of the answer has to do with the way that we do science, which is part of the answer lies in the idea that we live in a culture of publish or perish. What do I mean by that? We have an incentive system that asks researchers like you and I to publish as much as possible in order to at some point secure a job that will not expire and leave us homeless or having to drive a cab or insert any other activity here. But we want to be researchers, so we want to score a job in academia, and in order to do that, we have to play the system. So we have to publish as much as possible. We have to publish in journals with a high impact factor, and especially as high as possible. We have to, in order to get that done, probably publish work with statistically significant results, because it's much easier to get those published. And we have to also publish work with surprising and catchy results, because again, it's much easier to get those published. So what does this mean? This means in order to become not just any researcher, but a queen researcher who can have her pick of the positions that she wants, and at some point no longer fear unemployment, this means we have to play the system. And playing the system can turn into gaming the system. So instead of using data for the purpose that we originally agreed, we kind of all want to follow, which is to find something out about the world, data becomes merely a rhetorical device in order to tell our story so that it can be easily marketed or easily sold, sounds mean, but easily placed in a high impact factor journal. And what do you have to do in order to get that done? Well, it's really easy. You just have to run many, many small studies. And this is helpful because it helps you inflate the false discovery rate. So it's more likely that you'll find a significant result. Excellent, we want those. And then if you're also a little bit flexible in how you collect the data, for instance, you take a look if your effect is just significant now, then this should be the point where you absolutely stop data collection. Or you are a little bit flexible in how you analyze the data, so that maybe you throw out a couple of outliers or some otherwise inconvenient participants. We call this p-hacking. Maybe you can also be a bit flexible in how you report the results and just come up with some hypothesis that you pretend you had all along after seeing the data, because this is clearly what just makes sense now. Now, this is very much geared towards empirical research, but also in the non-empirical research or non-experimental, non-quantitative work, it can be helpful to hide your data and materials so that no one else can see what you've done or follow the train of thought that you've put forward. And whatever you do, never do it again, because you might not find the same result. So if you want to game the system, this is how you should do it. But it is also immediately clear that this comes with problems, because we are no longer talking about finding something about the world, finding out something about the world, but now we're just talking about producing data that fits a story that we had anyway. So this is data that supports our personal, let's say, narrative of what we want the world to be like, and it doesn't actually reflect what the world is like. And that is a problem. And this is why we sometimes talk about science in crisis, because it moves away from the actual purpose of doing science. Now, that all sounds pretty bleak and unhopeful, but what can we do? Well, open science to the rescue. Open science is a reform movement that tries to put science on the rails of good scientific practice, so that we can actually rely on the things that we read when we try to follow a cake recipe, but in science. I'm jumping metaphors. I hope that's it's not too annoying for you. Okay, and now let me talk a little bit about different areas of open science that can help us make science better. One of these areas is what we call pre-registration. So pre-registration is kind of an announcement of the hypotheses that you have for a specific piece of work, be it experimental or not, before you go ahead and test that hypothesis, before you, for instance, collect the data and run your statistical analysis. And the idea is that you can put your hypothesis in a place in the world where later on you can show that you had this before, you had this idea before you ran your analysis, or you did whatever you do to create insight. And then we can be sure, or we can be more sure that you didn't make up your hypothesis to match your data. And there are different perspectives on what people think, if this is a great idea or if it's not. Some people say that pre-registration actually destroys science because it destroys our opportunity to just freely discover what the data, to let the data speak, so to say. But this is not actually how it was intended. So pre-registration doesn't mean that you can't explore your data. It is just there to help you differentiate between confirmatory testing, so testing things that you predicted were going to happen, and exploring what might happen and you didn't really have an expectation. So pre-registration is meant, and this is kind of the other side of the story, is meant to increase trust in science by helping us differentiate what we predicted compared to what is sort of a novel emergent phenomenon that just comes from your data, but perhaps needs a second attempt, a second study, a replication that can show that it's indeed an effect that is there. And this also brings me to the second point, the second part of talking about pre-registrations. They're also helpful because they can make us more confident in the results, in the sense that they weren't added, that the hypotheses weren't added to match the data. And here is an example that I think is pretty striking. So this is data from randomized controlled studies run between 1970 and 2012. And those were big randomized control studies. Like, there was a lot of money involved. So you can tell that those aren't just tiny bachelor's thesis projects, but this is like where the real money went. So they cost more than $500,000 per year to run. And all of these studies as a primary outcome had a cardiovascular risk, event, or death. So something like dying from a heart attack, which again, this is not something small. This is a meaningful and important and a difficult to research thing. And it could literally save lives if you do a randomized control study on a drug that can reduce the risk of having a heart attack. Now, and this is what these studies were about. They wanted to show if a specific drug could reduce the risk of having a cardiovascular event. And in these years, 1970 to 2000, what you can see, this is to the left of the graph, is that there are a bunch of trials going on where some reported null effects, those are the green dots, and many of them reported benefits of the drug that was tested. Those are the little black pluses. And then one thing changes. So you see there's a line at 2000. And then after that, the data looks quite different. You see lots of more green dots. You see less trials that show the benefits, so less black pluses. And you even see one that shows a harm. So this is the red strike through thing. We didn't have a single study that actually was harmful before 2000. So what changed? Like what changed the distribution here? In 2000, it became mandatory that the primary outcomes of randomized controlled studies would be pre-registered in the United States. And my question here is just, which drug would you rather take? Would you rather take the drug from before 2000, where there is some evidence that there is a benefit, but you don't know what the original hypothesis was, or so that it's possible that just the hypothesis was changed to match the data? Or would you take the drug that was developed after 2000, where we know what the original hypothesis was? So this is the idea of increasing confidence in science if you do pre-register, but this is also not fail-safe. And here, this is again data from randomized controlled studies, and these were published between 2015 and 16 in 5 top medical journals. And what the authors of the Compare project did is they all of this should be pre-registered, and they checked about 70 trials. And took a look at how they managed in sticking to the pre-registration. And what they found is that only 9 trials were perfect, but in the other ones, there were 350 outcomes not reported that the original pre-registration said should be reported. And then there were another 360 new outcomes silently added that were not in the pre-registration. So this is something that we sometimes call open washing. So giving something the idea that it has to do with open science and good scientific practice because there is a pre-registration, but only if we actually check and follow up on this, can we make sure that it can be used as intended. So that means even when you see a pre-registered study, it makes sense for you to take a look at what was actually pre-registered, because maybe what was pre-registered isn't actually what is in the paper. Where can you pre-register? I'm just going to plug really quickly. One place to do this is the Open Science Framework. It's a place where you can do other open science things as well, but I don't want to spend a lot of time speaking about this right now. Just know that the internet has a way. The internet also has a way for replication work. I'm going to come back to this internet reference in just a second. But I've already introduced what it means to replicate. So this means to run a study again. And there are kind of two different approaches that you can take and how to do this. One way would be to go broad and say, I want to I want to know about as many studies as possible, or as many research outputs as possible if I can do it again. Then you would try to replicate many studies. And there are some projects that are doing this. For instance, the DARPA SCORE project that's going on at the moment, or there is the Hagen Cumulative Science project, which uses bachelor's thesis to replicate work in the judgment and decision-making research area. And I think they did about 80 theses on replication work already. So this is really helpful. And this is also a great way for student researchers to be involved. So you can go this broad way, or you can go deep and narrow, and you can try replicating the same study with a lot of participants and with a lot of researchers involved, and perhaps also different research labs. So you can study differences in how, let's say, maybe more or less experienced researchers will approach this. And formats that are available for this are, for instance, the registered replication reports. There are projects called many labs projects that do exactly this. And there's also a pretty cool one that I want to plug here, which is the study swap idea. So this is basically just a page on the Open Science Framework where you can put your work and you can say, look, does anyone have time to replicate my study that I just ran in my dissertation work? And people, if they have at the end of their own research, if they have 10 minutes left, they can just add your thing and replicate it. But you can also do this for others. So if you have a study to run, let's say once labs open again, whenever that might be, and you have 10 minutes left and you don't know what to do with these 10 minutes, you can go to Study Swap and see if someone needs help replicating their work. And finally, I want to add the Science Accelerator, which is an exciting place for everyone in psychology to check out, because they're trying to join forces of many researchers to replicate work in the psych area. And they also pick, sort of in a democratic way, they pick which research to do next. I think at the moment, this evaluation is going on. So if you go to the Psych Science Accelerator Twitter handle, you can see them asking for people to vote or rate the different studies that are available at the moment. So this would be then the next kind of wave of big replications that would be run. Yeah. Okay, so enough talk about replications, but one thing that actually kind of ties into it is that once you have resources available, you can maximize their impact by sharing them. So if you've run your replication study that you've done facilitated via Study Swap, for instance, it would be helpful if you, for instance, make this available on places like Curate Science, which collect data on specific research questions and then automatically calculate a meta-analysis. Isn't that super cool? Sharing resources also means sharing, for instance, if you have access to really difficult to access samples. There's the so-called Many Babies project, because apparently babies are super difficult to get in the lab. So if you can share the amount of research hours on babies that you have available, because again, you maybe have 10 minutes left at the end of your experiment, then this can make some other researchers' lives really easier and much better. But sharing is not only about the resources, but also about brain power. Well, maybe brain power is also a resource. So this example is from the Atlas collaboration. That's something then outside of psychology for a change. The Atlas collaboration testing the standard model in physics. And this involved actually about 3,000 authors from more than 180 institutions working together on trying to understand if Einstein was right. So, and then there's another example here, the Human Genome Project, which was a 13-year joint effort to decode and sequence the human genome, where the data is now publicly available. So the idea is that if you can join a community, the resources that you have available, which are no doubt limited. Nobody has time, nobody has all the money that we would want. We basically, as researchers, have limitless hunger for more resources to invest in our resource. But if you do have some resource available, you can make it so much more effective by sharing it with others, whether it's brain power or it's access to research time or something else. But joining this community of sharing and this cooperative idea can really also be part of open science. I want to now break a little bit with this idea of just the community and go to something that is more, not just the people, but also the hard stuff, the tangible things. So it's not only about the soft niceness of great cooperation, but it's also about sharing access to, for instance, hardware, software, and sharing how you've done something, documenting properly how you've done your work so that others can bake the same cake. In terms of hardware and software, the open community is actually really making huge steps forward in creating hardware and software that are different from the proprietary soft and hardware that classically have been used. So let's go with the example of software. Maybe if you are like me, you grew up in psychology with using SPSS. And now we know that there's this cool thing called R available, which is an openly licensed type of software to which you can contribute. If you know how to code something, you can contribute to developing this software. And there's also a massively amazing community of people online who will exchange help on how to do something in the software. And something similar is happening in the hardware area, where usually hardware is produced, let's say, microscopes or, I don't know, other measurement devices can be really difficult to finance because they tend to be quite expensive and are also often difficult to adapt to specific circumstances. Like if the specific device is just a bit too small to fit into your experimental setup, then you have to build it yourself. And making plans available for how to build something and, let's say, 3D printing it yourself, that's a great way to produce hardware locally at a lower cost than the proprietary devices that might be otherwise needed. And they might be more adaptable to the specific needs of a research question. So there's a ton happening in terms of open hardware, open software, and also in terms of documentation that's just about the hard facts of how science is done, the nitty-gritty and the details of this work. Now, how science is done also has a lot to do with publishing. We talked initially about the idea that you have to publish, otherwise there's just no way for you to be the successful researcher that you want to be. And publishing also is one of the integral parts of the open movement. So open also means making parts of making your research transparent in the sense that you share your data, your code, your materials, but also the final paper or the steps to the final paper that you're producing. So sharing your preprints, postprint, sharing what you do in terms of the peer review. I mean, this is also kind of a publication, no? Many people put a lot of time and effort into making great comments and helping others make their papers better. There's often the idea that peer review should also be opened and more transparent so that others can benefit from this work that reviewers put in. Publishing also means that you make results that are non-significant public, so that you save others the work of trying to beat a dead horse. And we can try to correct publication bias in the literature. And lastly, it is also helpful if you contribute towards meta-analysis that help us get a systematic overview of a specific research question across different data collection points. Now, in order to do science, you have to learn how to do science. So does open have anything to do with teaching and learning? Well, yeah, I think it totally does. And there are two perspectives. One of them is related to open educational resources. So when you're at uni and you learn about doing science or a specific area of science that you're trying to become acquainted with, you often have textbooks that tell you about the status quo in the area. And these things tend to be really expensive. And using an expensive textbook is actually often a reason why students will drop a class or not perform as well because they can't afford it or can't afford the latest version. And using instead open educational materials. So that means textbooks that are available for free to use and to be changed can reduce these barriers for education. And again, these open materials, just similarly to the hardware, tend to be easier to adapt because they are published under a license that allows educators, in this case, to adapt them. So this is often the case. And that means if you have a specific course that, let's say, I'm in the crossroads between social psychology and cognitive psychology, and I want to take a bit of both and put it in my course, that would be much easier for me to do if I could mix and match from open educational resources. But now that we're talking about open science, of course, we also have to learn how to do open science. So open science knowledge, I think, is also part of the learning and education part of the open movement. And this involves a bunch of different things like philosophy of science. So what does it even mean to do science? How do we know if something is true? And it also involves learning about methods and statistics. What is p-hacking and why is it a problem? What is alpha error inflation and why should I care? And then also some meta knowledge about what is the research cycle and how do I in each what do I have to pay attention to? And now I'm just going to plug 3 different resources for you here if you are interested in learning more about these topics. One of them is an online course that I've developed, and I think this has been mentioned in the introduction as well. And this deals with sort of the philosophical background, the epistemology of what is true and how can we, with our research, contribute to finding something out about the world. For methods and statistics, definitely go check out Daniel Larkins's course on statistical inference. I did this and it helped me massively become a better statistician. It's a really helpful course, and this is the only, I want to say, it's the only Coursera course that I actually finished. That's how cool it is. And for a sort of meta knowledge on how to do research along the cycle of how we do research, there's this cool resource, how to open.science, and it gives you answers to basically FAQs that you might have and that can come up in any part of the research cycle. So if you are doing your planning of a specific study, you can go there and ask this website, okay, what should I pay attention to? And it's a really helpful resource. Okay, last topic I want to touch on before I finish is science policy. Does open have anything to say about that? Well, what we can see is that open science has changed the science policy landscape a little bit in the past couple of years. So what I've talked to you about so far, it's not only preaching, but it's actually having some impact as well. And what we can see is that open science is increasingly becoming an important topic in funding decisions. So this means, for instance, that when it's about hiring, some universities, for instance, have put in their job adverts that they're looking for candidates who can demonstrate that they have a commitment to open science and that they know how to, let's say, write a data management plan. So this is becoming a skill that you need to be able to demonstrate in order, let's say, to get a postdoc position. Funding agencies more and more require that for you to get a third-party funding, you can demonstrate how you are going to use the data and make it available and make your publication available in the end. So open science is also sort of leaking into this process. Finally, more and more people argue about economically and ethically using funding, and that sharing resources and replicating work and correcting publication bias is actually necessary because it down the line helps us use the funding that we have in a better way and not waste taxpayer money on beating a dead horse, that trying to find an effect that we should know is not there, but we don't know because nobody is publishing non-significant results. And also not just waste taxpayer money, but also not waste the time and the efforts of our participants if this is a human subject. So funding is changing, as is communication about science. So more and more people are talking about science in terms of science communication, and this is becoming increasingly popular, at least in Germany. And I don't know what the exact landscape looks like in the UK, but maybe we can chat about this later. So hard science in the public discourse is becoming more and more popular, and involving citizens in doing science does too. So I know, for instance, about a project where citizens help spotting birds, and then therefore understanding migration patterns. So they basically record their spottings of birds and then report them to a researcher who uses this data, which I think is a fantastic way of engaging and talking about science. And then I again want to bring up open educational resources, because they are accessible even if you don't have a lot of money and if you're not inside a university and using some sort of an eduroam server, let's say. So they can also help spread knowledge about science to the world. And then finally, I think open science is a lot about democratizing the way that we do science, because it improves access in any different area that you can think of. The more open and the more transparent research becomes, the easier it is to access it. And this is, so I want to end with this idea that open science is really committed to increasing access, so making scientific questions, methods, and findings freely accessible and usable for all, and therefore basically just refocusing on good scientific practice, so that in the end what we're aiming at is shedding light in the fog and understanding the world. What we want for that, though, is a solid basis for insight. And now these are all the different bits that I've talked about in this talk here. So everything from hardware to pre-registration to publishing a paper can be part of this process of building a solid basis on which we can base our insights on. So my last sentence basically is, let's do it, let's change the game, and let's do open science. And with that, just a brief thank you to the two women who've helped me develop this presentation. One of them is Susan Fiedler, my PhD supervisor, my former PhD supervisor, and Johanna Havemann, whom I work with together at the Open Science Fellowship. And if you want to read up a summary of this, I have a QR code here and a link as well to a preprint that basically summarizes what I've talked about today and gives some more examples and links so that you can make the most out of this presentation and leverage it for your own work. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm so curious to hear what you have to say.